something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Hello and welcome back to Meet Mozart. I'm Angie, that's Mozart, and today we're going to be talking about the character of Ophelia from Shakespeare's Hamlet. Now, why on a YouTube channel that focuses on classical vocal music am I bothering to get into Shakespeare? Well, as I mentioned before in our What is Art Song video, art song is usually music that is set to a pre-existing text, and most often that text is poetry. But it can also be pulled from other works of literature and plays, and so there's always a really big link between those things, those other art forms, and music. And Ophelia is a character that pops up a lot in art song, so we're going to get to know her character and then see how some other composers have chosen to represent her. But before we get to know Ophelia, we're going to real quick brush up our Shakespeare and walk you through the plot of Hamlet. So from the beginning of the play, which is set in Denmark in the castle Elsinore, we know that King Hamlet has died and that his brother Claudius is the new king, and that Claudius has also married King Hamlet's widow, Gertrude. And this is all very upsetting to our main character, Prince Hamlet, for several reasons. First of all, it's only been 2 months since his father has passed away, and he is still deeply grieving. Whenever he expresses this grief to Claudius and Gertrude, they wave him off. They basically tell him to man up because death happens, everybody dies, and he should just get over it and move on to celebrating their marriage. The marriage, Hamlet finds appalling. He's deeply offended that his mother has waited not 2 months to marry his uncle, and he often refers to that relationship as incestuous. Thirdly, and this isn't something that Shakespeare directly expresses through Hamlet's lines, is that Claudius is actually sort of a usurper to the throne. Traditionally, if the king died, the position would be passed down to his son. But for whatever reason, whether it's through his own standing, whether he manipulated the court, or by his marriage to Gertrude, Claudius has inserted himself into the line of succession. So even though Hamlet doesn't openly express his feelings about that, that's got to be something that's weighing on him as well. In the meantime, some funny stuff has been going on the night watch, and several guards have claimed that they are seeing a specter, a ghost, that fits the exact likeness of King Hamlet. They bring in Horatio, who's a courtier and a friend of Hamlet's, to take a look and see if he sees it as well, which he does. And Horatio decides it's time to tell Prince Hamlet about what's going on. So they invite Prince Hamlet to join the watch that night, and they again see this specter. And this time the specter calls Hamlet to speak with him alone. Hamlet follows, and of course it is the ghost of King Hamlet, and he tells them that he has been murdered, and that because of that he's stuck in this hell-like purgatory because he wasn't able to confess his sins before death. And if King Hamlet was the warrior king that everyone seems to think he was, he probably would have had a good amount of blood on his hands, so that confession is pretty important. Who murdered King Hamlet, you might ask? Well, none other than his brother and usurper, Claudius. He then asks Hamlet to seek his revenge on Claudius, but makes a very specific request that Gertrude not be harmed, because he still seems to have some feelings for her. Hamlet agrees and then runs back to Horatio and the guards, making them swear that no matter how bizarrely he acts, that they will promise never to tell anyone about what they saw that night. Then Hamlet starts acting really crazy. When he speaks, he doesn't make sense. Everything's in this kind of weird code, or it's very not logical. And so Claudius, Gertrude, and the rest of the court become concerned that perhaps Hamlet has been driven mad over his grief for his father. Why Hamlet's course of action to take revenge includes acting like he's crazy, which at this point we can pretty much see that it's not real because he can turn it on and off, we don't really know. But we can guess that it has something to do with the fact that madmen and jesters in this court, in this time period, seem to be able to speak truth to power with impunity. but more on that in video 4. Ultimately, however, besides acting strangely, Hamlet really takes no action to avenge his father's death, and he seems very torn. King Claudius and Gertrude become really concerned with Hamlet's behavior, and so they ask a couple friends of Hamlet's from England, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to come to Denmark and see if they can't talk to Hamlet and find out what's the matter. Unfortunately for King Claudius, Gertrude, Rosencrantz, and Guildenstern, Hamlet sees through their plot really quickly, and so he confides absolutely nothing in RNG, as I will go ahead and continue to refer to them as, because they're basically functioning as the same person and they have 2 very long names. RNG go ahead and bring with them an acting troupe that they hope will cheer up Hamlet. And when Hamlet sees the players perform, he finally becomes inspired to take an action. Not the revenge part of the action, he'll get to that later, maybe, but first he has to prove without a doubt that Claudius is actually guilty of the murder. After all, that specter that he saw could have been a devil that was presenting itself as his father in order to entrap him and get him to murder and sin. So he's really got to be sure. And in order to get that clarity, he asks the troupe to perform a play that involves a king being murdered by a relative. And he even gets the players to reenact his father's own portrayal of his murder. You know, the whole poison to the ear while you're napping trick. He also writes a speech that he hopes will draw out Claudius's guilty conscience. Sure enough, whenever Claudius sees the stage action and hears the speech, he runs out of the theater, taking with him any ounce of concern that Hamlet had about his innocence. And of course, being upset by what he's seen, Claudius then asks RNG to take Hamlet with them back to England. Now Hamlet knows that he can righteously go forth and avenge his father's death. But first, he's got to go talk to his mom, because she's asked him to see her in her chambers. When Hamlet arrives in Gertrude's chambers, he really doesn't hold back anymore. And he openly tells her that she has offended both God and the memory of his father by remarrying Claudius. And the two begin to quarrel, things sort of escalate, and Gertrude cries out, inspiring a yell from a nearby curtain. Hamlet, thinking that the curtain is King Claudius, stabs that curtain, only to have the lifeless body of one of the king's advisors, Polonius, fall out in front of him. Now, Gertrude is shocked, and she can't imagine or figure out or understand why Hamlet would behave in such a way that he would actually want to murder King Claudius. And so he eventually tells her Claudius is the murderer of his father. And she's very shocked by it, but she almost seems to kind of take it in until the ghost of King Hamlet appears and starts talking to Hamlet. And Hamlet starts talking back to it, but Gertrude can't see the ghost, and so she again thinks that Hamlet is crazy, that he's talking to someone who isn't there. But eventually Hamlet sort of does get Gertrude back on his side, and it seems that they're actually in agreement that Gertrude is going to try to get Claudius to admit to the murder. So seemingly getting Gertrude on his side, Hamlet then drags Polonius's body away, hides it under the stairs, and prepares to go to England. Gertrude, apparently not convinced that Hamlet isn't crazy, or perhaps fearing for her own life because she realizes if Claudius could have murdered her husband, he could murder her as well, runs to Claudius and tells him that Hamlet has gone off the deep end, that he murdered Polonius thinking that it was in fact King Claudius. Claudius, realizing that Hamlet's out to get him and fearing for his own life, makes plans for Hamlet to be murdered upon arrival in England. But of course, once again, Hamlet figures out the plan, and on their trip to England switches out the letter for his own murder for one that tells them to murder RNG upon arrival. But their voyage to England goes a bit awry when they have a run-in with some pirates and Hamlet is kidnapped. Meanwhile, while Hamlet hangs out with his new pirate buddies, Laertes, Polonius's son, comes back from France to Denmark. He's upset and wants to avenge the death of his father, who he believes was killed by Claudius. And he's also very upset, as anyone would be at the time, that his father's body was not properly cared for and that he didn't get a proper burial. And so he stormed the castle, ready to fight Claudius, when Claudius tells him, "It was not me, it was my crazy nephew/son, Hamlet." And that he is very eager to see Polonius's death avenged. And in fact, he's sort of already taking care of it by sending Hamlet to England with a letter that says, "Kill upon arrival." So Horatio, basically Hamlet's only friend at this point, gets a letter from Hamlet saying that the pirates have been pretty cool with him and they actually just dropped him off in Denmark and he's on his way back to Elsinore to face Claudius. When Claudius finds out that Hamlet isn't dead, he enlists the help of Laertes. And this is because, again, Claudius is married to Hamlet's mother. Also, the courtiers and the people of Denmark seem to like Hamlet, so he can't just up and kill him. So he gets Laertes involved, and the plan is this. There's going to be a duel. But Laertes is going to take the protective foil off the tip of his sword so that he can actually strike Hamlet for real. And Laertes is like, "That's a good idea, but you know what I'll do? I know a guy that has some poison. I will dip my sword in that poison so that that way, if I even so much as scratch him, he's for sure dead." And Claudius is like, "Good idea, man. I like the cut of your jib, but let's make sure that we've got this thing covered from every angle. So if you don't hit him and he wins the first round, I'll offer him a glass of wine with poison in it." And so the two of them think they've got a pretty rock-solid plan and nothing's gonna go wrong. So Hamlet returns and they have their duel and things get started and Hamlet wins round one, so Claudius offers him a glass of wine and Hamlet says, "No, no thank you, not thirsty, I'll pass." They fight again, Hamlet wins round two, Claudius offers the wine. Again he refuses because he'd rather focus on the battle, but Queen Gertrude picks up the glass and drinks to Hamlet's health. Gulp. Claudius is like, "Well, not really anything I can do now." And the fight continues. Laertes strikes Hamlet, drawing blood. So now Hamlet has been struck and is going to die, but not quite yet. And the two continue to fight and scuffle and scramble, and their swords get switched, so that Hamlet strikes Laertes with his own sword with that poison tip, and so now Laertes has been struck as well. So he's also going to die, but not quite yet. First, Gertrude falls down dying and calling out Hamlet's name. Then Laertes, also struck, also dying, tells Hamlet this whole thing was a plot to kill him. There's poison in the wine, there's poison on the sword, there's poison everywhere. And asks for his forgiveness, which Hamlet grants to him because, let's face it, these are just two kids trying to avenge the death of their father. And so he gets Hamlet's forgiveness and he dies. And then Hamlet, now knowing everything that's been planned, goes up and stabs Claudius with the poisoned sword and forces him to drink the rest of the cup of poisoned wine. Claudius dies immediately, and as Hamlet lies there, dying slowly, he instructs Horatio to please tell their story. So that's the plot of Hamlet, though you may have realized there's one character we left out. And that's because, although the scenes with her do help to support certain things that are going on in the plot, actually nothing that she does bears any weight on the plot. However, the actions of all these other characters and the plot itself bears the ultimate weight on her. And that is Ophelia, or help, as her name means in Greek. So let's take a look at the plot from her perspective. So before the beginning of our play, we know that Ophelia and Hamlet have been spending lots of time together. He's been writing her really beautiful love letters and showing her various types of affection. How various, Shakespeare is actually too polite to say, so we don't really know, but we can kind of figure it out as her story unfolds. However, despite all of his affections, the reality is that Hamlet and Ophelia during this time period could probably not have ever been married. And that's because Hamlet is a prince. And so any marriage that would have been arranged for him would need to have some sort of political advantage, and Ophelia is not royalty, so she wouldn't have been able to offer anything in a marriage of that sort. And Ophelia's brother Laertes and her father Polonius are very aware of this. And so both of them warn her not to take her time with Hamlet seriously, and in fact they instruct her to break off her relationship with Hamlet, which we don't see happen in the actual stage action, but we're to understand that she does. The next time that she sees Hamlet is after he's apparently seen the ghost, and he runs into her chambers, grabs her by the wrists, looks her in the eye like a madman, and then leaves the room without ever looking away. And this is very upsetting to Ophelia, so of course she runs to her father Polonius to tell him what's happened. And he starts to realize, oh, maybe Hamlet's not mad because he's grieving for his father. Maybe he's just a teenager in love, and my daughter just broke his heart. And so he goes to Claudius and Gertrude and tells them that, I think this might not have anything to do with his father. It could really be that he's just brokenhearted. And of course, Claudius and Gertrude are really happy to think that it could be anything besides their own actions that cause Hamlet to be upset. So in order to test this theory, Polonius and Claudius come up with a plan. They're going to hide behind a curtain, because that is Polonius's solution to all problems, and have Ophelia accidentally run into Hamlet while they watch the exchange to see how they behave together. So they get Ophelia ready for her run-in and hide, and then Hamlet enters and says his whole to be or not to be speech, which is going through and weighing the pros and cons of staying alive whenever life is so difficult and such a burden, or committing the act of suicide. And what's really interesting is that although nowadays that scene would be staged with Hamlet on stage by himself, it's extremely plausible that Ophelia could be standing right there, and that he may even know that she's standing right there, and perhaps even directing the speech to her. So all of those things are possible, but after this big speech, they finally do speak directly to one another, unquestionably, and it's very awkward. They go into a lot of awkward small talk, and then Ophelia tells him that she wants to return his letters. He tells her, I never gave you any. She says, yes, you did. And then he says, I did love you once. And her response to that is, indeed, my lord, you made me believe that you did. And I think this response is one that really sets Hamlet off. And he rebukes her and says, you shouldn't have believed me, because in fact, I didn't love you. He tells her to go to a nunnery, which was a common term for a brothel, and also a place where unwed mothers would have gone to seek some kind of safety. He insults her and basically takes out all of the anger that he's had toward Gertrude for her infidelity, for her unfaithfulness to his father, and puts it all on Ophelia, and actually, as though Ophelia represents, in his mind, the worst of womankind. He tells her not to bear children, and is just extremely aggressive, and then leaves. After he leaves, Ophelia is left alone, thinking to herself, what has happened? This man was the pride of Denmark, and now he behaves so cruelly. And after that, Claudius and Polonius come out of their curtain hiding place, and Claudius plans what to do next. He decides it's time to send Hamlet back to England and starts preparing for those things. Polonius is there plotting with him, and only at one point in the script do they turn to Ophelia and acknowledge her, but only to say, Ophelia, don't worry about telling us what happened, we heard it all. And while there is room within the staging directions for Polonius to perhaps offer her some sort of comfort, we don't see any element of that necessarily in the script. And so she's basically left to deal with the terrible thing that's just happened to her on her own. Later that evening, Ophelia is invited to attend a play in the court. And so she takes her seat, and Hamlet comes in. Gertrude asks Hamlet, would you like to sit by me? He says no. here is metal more attractive, referring to Ophelia, and takes his seat next to her. And this, in my opinion, is the part of the play where if we had any question about the quality of their relationship or if their relationship was actually physicalized, I think this would answer it, because he sits next to her and then talks to her in innuendo that would make a modern listener blush. And if she were just a naive young girl of that time period, I think to hear those things being said to her would be absolutely devastating. But her response, while definitely annoyed and frustrated, is actually very calm and very strong. But of course, the play comes to a very abrupt end as Claudius rushes out of the theater. When we next see Ophelia, her character has taken an abrupt turn. Her father has been murdered by her former lover, Hamlet, and his body has been hidden and no one knows where. She comes in disheveled, with her hair down, which was a taboo for the time. She starts singing snippets of old songs about pilgrims and death and burial, and about a guy who sleeps with a girl, promising to marry her, but then after sleeping together, breaks his promise. She hands out flowers and then abruptly asks for her coach, which she doesn't have, and leaves, with everyone thinking that she's gone insane because of the death of her father. And what's interesting is that Laertes, even though he's certainly shocked and upset by what he sees when she's in the room, doesn't bother to follow her and help her or try to talk to her. And so at this point, her father is dead, Hamlet's gone, Laertes is too consumed with revenge to even try to help her or talk to her except for when she's placed right in front of him. And so you have to wonder who's even taking care of her at this point. She's just a mad woman roaming a castle. After this, we never see Ophelia again alive. When Claudius and Laertes are working on their multi-level poison plan, Gertrude interrupts and tells them that Ophelia has died. Apparently, in her madness, she was weaving a wreath out of flowers and was trying to use some of the branches from the willows, and the willow branch broke and she fell into the water. And instead of swimming back to shore, she allows the water to really take her over. And Gertrude even describes it as being nymph-like. What's interesting about Gertrude's account of Ophelia's death is that she goes into some really specific details, down to what flowers she was using to make the wreath, what songs she was singing as she was pulled under, and even how her skirts looked as they were billowed up. And one has to wonder if she was close enough to see all of those things. Was she not also close enough to go in and help, or to at least call for help? And that's one thing that is completely left out of Gertrude's account. The last time we see Ophelia is at her funeral, which is under a lot of scrutiny because a lot of people saw it as a suicide, which meant in that time that she would not have gotten traditional funeral rites. In fact, her body would have been thrown out of town, most likely. So the fact that there's any procession at all is a very upsetting thing for some of the characters, especially the priest. And it is this scene that Hamlet sees as he returns to Elsinore. And he and Horatio hide behind a tree while Laertes, Claudius, and Gertrude enter behind Ophelia's funeral procession. During this whole thing, Laertes is very upset that she's not given the full funeral rites, and he actually leaps into her grave in grief. And at this point, Hamlet pops his head out from behind whatever tree and declares, "I loved her more than any brother ever could," and the two scuffle and are pulled apart. And of course, Claudius reminds Laertes, wait until the duel, which we all know what happens there. So why did Shakespeare write a character whose actions have absolutely no bearing on the plot? We'll probably never know for sure, but perhaps he's trying to convey the moral that if we allow ourselves to be completely consumed with hatred and murder and revenge, we stand the chance of destroying even the good things in our life, such as Ophelia, as well as ourselves. whatever his intentions may have been, it's really easy to see why a character who leaves us with so many more questions than answers is one that has drawn the attraction of so many composers. So for those of you that are familiar with our channel, you might know that we usually post on the 1st and the 15th of each month. However, this month we're going to shake things up a little bit, and we're going to post every single week a new part of this Ophelia series. So please join us next week where we continue, and we're going to go into how Shakespeare's audiences would have heard the songs that Ophelia was singing, and also look at a setting by Elizabeth Maconchy. I also want to be sure to thank Melinda Hall, who's a Shakespeare expert that's going to appear in some of our later parts of this series. She's been a huge help for helping me kind of bounce ideas off of and get a deeper understanding of what the life and times of people in the Shakespearean age would have been like. So I hope you'll join us for part 2 next week. And until then, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, push all the fun buttons, including that little notification bell, and we will see you next